To my fellow YouTubers, could you please stop referring to this deck as an old or classic deck, please? I was playing the game competitively for about 3 years when this first came out, and hearing that makes me feel old as hell, and I don't like it. Sincerely, the old fart who runs this channel. Okay, in all seriousness, take a journey with me back to 2008. For the last several years, Monarch has arguably been the best deck in the game, and while decks like Card Trooper and DDT have been pushing the speed and power of decks, for the most part the game has been very slowly speeding up, and I'm sure you'll be able to keep on top of it in the future. Now imagine Konami then drops 3 decks that utterly break the game back to back to back in the next 3 sets, including a deck that fusion summons multiple times a turn without polymerization, something unheard of in the 2000s, a deck that spams Dad and Synchros onto the board like it's nothing, and the subject of today's video, a deck that can mill half its deck in a couple of turns while spamming multiple cards onto the board early before nuking everything with a Dark Hole with Blue Eyes stats. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lightsworn. The first Yu-Gi-Oh deck to be built around the concept of self-milling, Lightsworn's goal is to use these kind of effects to fill the graveyard up very quickly, to both cast its massive boss monster and special summon powerful monsters from the graveyard, to quickly overwhelm the opponent with a game plan far faster than much of what Edison offers. One if not the most aggressive deck in the format, win quick or die trying may as well be this deck's motto, as depending on how well you mill, you can either be swinging for lethal on turn 3, or to be decked out by turn 7 onwards. It's explosive, risky, it's a lot of fun to play, it's Lightsworn, so let's take a look, shall we? Let's begin our look back at this deck with a card that encapsulates what Lightsworn is capable of. It's first of 3 limited or semi-limited archetypal cards in Lumina, the Lightsworn Summoner. As not only is she one of the most powerful cards in the archetype at this point, but she is also a great showcase of everything this deck stands for. A level 4 monster, this card can, at the cost of a discard, revive any Lightsworn from the graveyard that is 4 stars or lower. In fact, that is soft once per turn, by the way. In addition to this, at the end phase, she makes her controller mill 3 cards from the top of their deck to the graveyard, which not only gives you a chance for some graveyard effects, but also more fuel for her first effect next turn. So as I've said, this deck is built around self-milling, however it's surprising how few actual graveyard effects Lightsworns by themselves have, making this card not just one of our best mill resources, but one of our best payoffs to all that milling, with it giving us access to a whole toolbox of powerful effects, including an MST, a double monster pop, and 2 decent beaters, including one with piercing damage. Essentially when playing this deck, summoning and protecting this card is one of our easiest paths to victory, and as such it was rightly put to 1 to try and limit this deck's power after it dominated a large part of late 2000s Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of this, we also sometimes run not just Lumina, but also ways of both protecting her and ways of getting her back from the graveyard if she's either removed by our opponent or milled by one of our other Lightsworns. And you know a card this good in a self-mill deck when players play cards we get no value of milling just to see her more often. Okay, so we've seen the basics of what most Lightsworn cards in this deck can do. They each have a pushed effect they can use either on summon or to put on the field, and to balance that they will mill you for a certain amount of cards at some point in the turn, usually at the end phase. However, most decks that mill themselves usually have many graveyard effects to complement the mills, something that, like I said earlier, Lightsworn surprisingly lacks that many of. However, there is one to talk about, a card that not only makes aggro strategies with this deck much stronger, but is also a historical first for Yu-Gi-Oh! Lightsworn Wolf is a 2100 attack 4-star beast, but before we get too excited about the push stats, there is a severe downside to compensate, that being he can't be normal summoned and can only be special summoned by the card effect. However, it can be summoned by its own effect, is sent from your deck to the card graveyard. So yeah, they may not have given Lightsworn that many with cards with good graveyard effects, but the one they did give was a really good one. In modern Lightsworn, this card is used as material for a variety of Link, XC and Synchro plays. However, in Edison, it is a good old-fashioned beater used to quickly end the game before being milled out. However, we do have to talk about the downside of this card, which is that it is arguably the first and one of the worst garnets in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. For those who don't know, a garnet is a Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that is essential for a deck strategy that you never actually want to draw, with the name coming from Gem Knight Garnet, a card played in decks that ran Brilliant Fusion that was next to useless if not in the deck, and Wolf is almost as bad as this card, with it being almost impossible to summon from the hand, and we only have a few ways to discard it with Lumina being at 1. Still, none of this changes the fact that we need to play 3 of this card, because putting up a total of 6,000 or more damage on the field in Edison is nuts, and it's usually worth the risk in this deck. Now, while Wolf is our only in-game grave effect here, we do have 2 of the cards in the archetype that do benefit from all the milling we'll be doing. One is our main win condition, so we'll save that for the end, but the other is Garroth Lightsworn Warrior. A decent beater at 1850 attack. This guy doesn't have an inherent mill like his fellow Lightsworns, he just piggybacks off their hard work. This is because for each time a card is milled by a Lightsworn other than him, Garroth allows us to mill 2 additional cards, and then draw a card for each Lightsworn he milled, making this guy a potter greed with a large body in a good scenario. And what makes it even better is, this effect is not once per turn. Every time a Lightsworn mills, you get this effect. We also have one other mill pair to talk about at the end, but for now we're pivoting back to our monsters with pushed effects to talk about with Lila Lightsworn Sorceress. A 1700 beat stick, this card, much like Lumina, also mills you for 3 during your end phase. However, her unique effect is that once per turn, she can return from a tight defense position and pop any spell trap card on the field. Essentially the breaker of Edison format, Lila serves as both an excellent beater with her 1700 points and a piece of back row hit you can use after you've attacked. And though she is stuck in defense for a turn after using her effect, that's what Lumina is for, to bring her back if her effect causes her death. Such good friends, eh? And next up to complement our back row hit, we have the monster popping Menace in Celestia Lightsworn Angel. Now, unlike the other cards we've covered so far, this card only mills once, milling 4 cards to activate her effects. Now, this does make her worse at feeling our boss monster and finding wolves, but in exchange for this, she will pop not 1, but 2 cards that opponent controls. Now, usually this will be used to clear the way of monsters for direct attacks, alongside other big beaters like Wolf and Garroth. However, alongside Lila, this card can be used to out cards like Royal Oppression and other nasty back row like Black Whirlwind and Necro Valley. Add on the 2300 attack points, which is massive for this deck, and you've got a Lightsworn to be feared here. And completing our trio of destruction effects, we have not just one of the best Lightsworn cards, but one of the best cards in all of Edison in Ryko Lightsworn Hunter, a card so good it's seen play in numerous decks outside of its own archetype, including the former top deck of Edison, Dandy Warrior. A level 2 beast, this card has a flip effect that is uniquely split into 2 parts that occur simultaneously. That being that 1, it can pop an opponent's card, and then 2, it will mill its controller for 3 cards, which by the way will occur regardless of whether or not another card was popped, meaning you can get your mills in this card without triggering your opponent's graveyard's effects. This card is such a powerhouse that we actually run 3 copies of the awesomely named Super Nimble Mega Hamster to summon it from the deck, and combined with the Celestia, this card makes it almost trivial for Lightsworns to break through most boards and swing in for an OTK. Oh, also one last thing, just so you guys know, Ryko and Edison does actually target. Its non-targeting rule change wasn't made till much later. This like won't come up too often, but it's something to keep in mind if you're going to play this deck. Up next we have 2 more regular beaters with mill effects stapled onto them in Jane Lightsworn Paladin, an 1800 attack beater that gains 300 points in the damage step and mills to an end phase, and Aaron Lightsworn Monk, a 600 attack beater that mills 3 at end step as well, and has the ability to spin set monsters back into the deck before damage calculation, making her ironically one of the best outs to Edison opponents using Ryko. Finally, for monsters with a Lightsworn name, we have Arcus Lightsworn Druid, who in addition to milling us 2 each turn, also acts as a pseudo-miscellaneous Saurus for the deck, because as long as he's on the field, neither player can target Lightsworns with card effects, anywhere. Yes, that's right, anywhere, including in graveyards, which means your opponent can't remove your wolves with something like DD Crow, for example, but more importantly, it means cards that would remove your Lightsworns, like Deep Prison, for example, no longer work, making it much easier once your board is set up to swing through a ton of damage and OTK the opponent. Just keep in mind this guy's effect is symmetrical in meta matches, and you'll be golden with this card. So we've gone through a bunch of cards with good effects that all mill you, but other than Wolf and arguably Garroth, what's the payoff for this? I mean, yes, most Lightsworns have pushed effects for the time, but they're quite small, and it seems this deck would have trouble closing the game out early without getting lucky with a bunch of wolves before getting milled up by their own effects late game. Well, that's where the boss of this deck comes into play in the explosive Judgment Dragon. A nuclear bomb on legs, JT as he's often known, is in addition to being a 3k body, a brutal bullet whip effect that destroys all of the cards in the field for the mere cost of 1000 life points. One of the best offensive and defensive cards in this deck, this card can be a dark hole when you're behind by clearing an established field, as long as your opponent hasn't got Scientist Dragon, of course. And also on the offense, this card can clear the way, all resistance, before your other Lightsworns come into play for a one-shot OTK. In addition to all of this card also mills for 4 in the end phase if the opponent somehow survives your attack to basically guarantee a win next turn. And what is the cost of playing this behemoth of a card? Having 4 different Lightsworn names in your graveyard. Yeah, that's it. This card, whose power is close to that of Dark Arm Dragon, only requires Lightsworn to basically play as it usually would for a couple of turns to be summoned. No wonder this guy's semi-limited. Now, outside of the Lightsworn archetype, we do have other cards to mention that synergize well with this heavy mill, graveyard filling aggro game plan, starting with the honorary Lightsworn member, Honest. In addition to being a prominent character in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Season 4, Honest is a light fairy that has 2 effects, one of which is crazy powerful in Lightsworn. Firstly, this card can bounce itself back to your hand during the main phase, which may not seem relevant, but it can make you a decent defender in a pinch before using its real effect. More importantly, however, is this card's hand trap effect, which during the damage step allows its controller to pitch it and pump one of their light attribute monsters by the same number of attack points as the opponent's monster they're battling has, pretty much guaranteeing you win any battle as long as this card's in your hand. Not obviously this card is a great offensive tool, being able to pump up your monsters for even more damage, however this card is more useful on the defense. Yeah, forget Mirror Force, this card is the reason I have trust issues, as there is no feeling worse than thinking of swinging for the game, only for the opponent to drop this on you and completely ruin your day. Also, like a lot of other cards from this era, this effect is not once per turn, and yes, it does stack. This one card is the reason Lightsworn can trample over even the biggest monsters, and like many cards in this deck, it was already hit thanks to this deck's power in the 2000s, with it being at 2 in Edison. Wrapping up this deck's monster lineup, we have 2 goals to both make the milling better and more plentiful with 3 cards in Card Trooper, Plague Spreader Zombie and Necro Gardener. Another limited card in this deck, Trooper, upon being summoned, is another mill 3 for this deck. However, unlike many of the Lightsworns, this guy actually does something after he mills, that being he gains 500 points per card milled till the end phase, making him another formidable beater in this deck. In addition to this, Trooper also draws you a card when he is destroyed, which likely will happen once his power boost wears off, making him overall one of the biggest advantage generators we have in this deck. Now our other 2 cards are also somewhat garnets in this deck, as they both want to be milled, but unlike Wolf, we can actually play them if we do draw them. First, there is Plague Spreader Zombie, which outside of the 2 Cyber Dragons in our side deck, is our only way of accessing our extra deck. A zombie tuner that can bring itself back from the grave by placing a card on top of your deck, which not only gives you multiple synchro summons, but also a way of unbricking your hands by putting wolves back on top. And rounding off this list is Necro Gardener, a monster that can be banished from grave to negate 1 attack by the opponent, which isn't actually amazing, but can be a lifesaver versus decks like Black Wings and other aggro strategies. In terms of our extra deck, it's the usual 5D era deck full of synchro good stuff, like Stardust Dragon to protect our monsters, Black Rose Dragon as another board wipe, and Goyo Guardian for its Snatch Steal-like effect. But one card I'd like to highlight in this extra deck is Mistworm. A level 9 synchro, this card needs 1 tuner and 2 non-tuners to summon it, which is pretty easy with our Lightsworns and Plague Spreader, and upon being summoned, it's essentially a pseudo Trishula that bounces 3 cards back to the owner's hand from the field. And the fact that if it resolves will usually lead to a quick win, because the opponent will be wide open for an attack after a board wipe like that. So as you can see from this monster lineup, Lightsworns is an Moving on to the spells now, and just like with the monster, we begin this list with a limited card in charge of the Light Brigade. And rather than the 2020's card designer who figured out time travel and went back to 2008 to add this card in Light of Destruction, because this card is basically a modern card in terms of its power. A normal spell, this busted piece of support allows us to mill 3 cards on activation, and we could stop there and this card would still be a good card, milling more than many of this deck's monsters, and being potentially most of their JD summoning, but no, it gets even better than that. You see, in addition to the massive amount of graveyard setup this card provides, you also get to search any Lightsworn level 4 or lower to your hand, giving you access to the one of Lumina, and then the whole toolbox of other monsters we just discussed. Or if you already have her in rotation, you could just get any other tool from the case without paying her cost. Although I guess calling this a 2020 card isn't completely accurate, as it is missing one feature that almost all cards now routinely have, and that's the once per turn clause. Yes, if you were lucky enough to draw 3 of this card back in 2008, you could search 3 cards, mill 9, and likely be so ahead of the opponent you couldn't lose between the field presence of the wolves and the numerous graveyard effects you likely now had access to, not to mention the JD that was now ready to blow them to pieces next turn. Yeah, I think it's clear why this card was at 1 during this time period. Now, if one busted spell in the archetype wasn't enough, we have a second in Solar Recharge, which, like Charge of the Light Brigade, is also busted for the time. Like Charge, still sees play to this day in the deck, but unlike Charge, this card has somehow still at 3 during this format. As a normal spell, Recharge allows its controller to pitch 1 Lightsworn to the grave, and then draw 2 and mill 2 in that order. So yeah, for a discard, this, let's be honest, is likely either going to be a dead wolf or an extra copy of some other Lightsworn. You essentially get a better pot of greed for the archetype, that also extends your plays. Now yes, this card can be a brick if you've got no Lightsworns in your hand, or it can be a complete downer if you, for example, draw 2 wolves, but those minute chances of failure are more than worth it for the massive plus this card will usually grant you, and then making this card an absolute must-have at 3 in this deck. Now, outside of these 2 archetypal cards, we also play a bunch of staples for the time, starting with Reinforcements of the Army, as a way of getting cards like Garoth and Jane, and Foolish Burial, which lets us send any card from our deck to the graveyard, which can not only get us easy access to Wolf, but also lets you set your extra deck plays, better being Plague Spreader Zombie, and it also turns on Judgment Dragon and Lumina much easier. In addition to this deck is one of the few that can actually play Monster Reincarnation. A normal spell, Reincarnation lets you discard a card from your hand and add a monster from the grave back to hand. Seen as too weak in many decks, this card in Lightsworn is actually pretty strong, as not only does it allow you more access to limited cards like Lumina, but also acts as another way of getting Zombie and Wolf into the graveyard. In addition to the consistency our archetypal cards offer, this deck also runs a Pot of Avarice. One of the many powerful pot cards, Avarice allows us to shuffle 5 cards from the grave back in the deck to draw 2 cards. Now obviously a Pot of Greed effect is good in any deck, especially in one like this, where the effect will always be relevant, but also this card gives us many other benefits, like more uses of JD, another chance to mill wolves at the discard, and again, more uses of Lumina. It's an amazing card in any graveyard deck, and you'd be a fool to play Lightsworn without a copy of it. And rounding out our spell lineup, we have a bunch of cards that make it easy to OTK our opponents by clearing their fields, such as the Busted Back Row Hate in Heavy Storm and Giant Trunade, and Lightning Vortex to destroy monsters. Overall, as we've seen here, Lightsworn really is a one-note aggro deck in Edison, and our spells always together to guarantee the maximum amount of damage possible in the quickest amount of time by clearing the field, getting more Lightsworns into our hands, and just furthering our strategy. Finally, we have our trap cards, and we'll be quick here, because no matter what build you're looking at, you're very unlikely to see more than 3 to 5 cards in these slots. First, we have the one card seen most commonly in all versions of this deck, in Beckoning Light. One of the oldest cards in the deck, having come out in the Ancient Sanctuary, this card is a great example of the all-in style of play Lightsworn uses, because this card requires us to pitch our entire hand to the graveyard. Quite a cost, wouldn't you say? Thankfully, the payoff is worth it, as essentially this card allows you to control to sculpt their hand, by starting a number of light monsters equal to the cards discarded and add them back to their hand from the graveyard. What this means is that Wolf in hand is no longer an issue, as you can trade him in for a Raikou or a Lumina. It can make Plague Spreader access much easier, and it also gives you multiple access to cards like JD, Honest and Lumina. Now, Beckoning Light is pretty much mandatory in most builds of this deck, and for the rest of our trap lineup is very flexible and can be adjusted to fit your meta. Some play Dust Tornado to out cards like Royal Oppression, others play Call of the Haunted as another copy of Lumina in the deck, while still others play more traditional traps like Mirror Force and Trap Dust Shoot. Overall, it's up to you which ones you pick. However, I would say don't pick more than 3 to 5 traps, because milling them really won't do you much good. So in conclusion, Lightsworn, while being a fairly one-note deck in Edison, is powerful, simple, and easily capable of putting up results in a skilled player's hands, while also being a good introduction deck for new players in the format. It will never be the best deck due to its random nature when milling, but its powerful playmakers will always make it a threat, and its continuous support following Edison makes it a deck players can invest in for multiple formats, making it a solid purchase option. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for the next Edison guide. We will finish our look back at this Lightsworn deck by discussing its many variants, because yes, there are definitely many options to choose from when playing Lightsworn. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.